Was once a time upon this land, man wandered where he pleased. Ate of the earth, slept under stars, begat his family.
But since that time, look what he's done. He's made it so unfit for everyone.
And we are waiting.
Yeah, so how did we get here? What are we doing here? This film is about the big picture, the beautiful story of human endeavor. Random chance mixing with human will. Ladies first. So we're starting with Millicent Ward Skinner. Here in Scotland is the home of her grandfather, George Skinner. I've chosen 8 pivotal people to have chapters exploring their family trees, and these are they, and you'll see their names come up before each chapter. The story of our great-grandfather George Chalmers Skinner, or George C., begins with his father, James Cassie Skinner. James Cassie Skinner was born in 1804 in the town of Pitsligo, Aberdeenshire, from a long line of Skinners in Aberdeenshire going back as far as 1680. In 1837, he married Isabella Maria Kennedy in the town of Ellen, Aberdeenshire, where she had grown up. By 1841, they were living at Keithfield near Tarvis, Aberdeenshire, with 3 young daughters, his younger brother Robert, her younger brother George, and the maid Agnes Novi. He was plying his trade as a stonemason. In 1842, son James is born, and in 1844, our great-grandfather George C. Skinner is born right here in Keithfield. This is Keithfield as it appears today. The barn is hidden up there on the right behind the house and trees. Who knows how it looked in 1841? No metal gates, at least. In England, houses had names, not addresses. Hence, Keithfield. In 1848, his wife Isabella dies at age 35, and he marries her younger sister Margaret. By 1851, he is employing 5 masons and farming 6 acres. George C. is 6 and is living with 3 sisters, his brother James, and Mary Ann Kennedy, age 10, whoever that was. James Cassie's mother, Sophie Hay, still up in Pitsligo, dies in 1857, and for that reason, or whatever other reason, the family immigrates to Ontario, Canada, to get a fresh start. By 1861, they were living in Brighton, Ontario, but moved that year to a farm in Haldimand County, Ontario. We don't know where exactly. George C. was now 25. James Cassie died in Haldimand County in 1871, his widow Margaret living there with her son Alexander until her death in 1897. The story now shifts to James Cassie's son, George C. Skinner, our great-grandfather, shown here in this photo we're lucky to have. George C. Skinner left Haldimand County about age 30 to come to Norfolk County, Ontario, and got himself 100 acres here in 1875. In 1877, he married Annie Tupper, shown here, resplendent in her fashionable dress of the day. How did they meet? Well, here's where she grew up, on her father Jeremiah Tupper's farm. Their son, James Arthur Keith Skinner, our grandfather called Keith, was born here in 1878. Mom describes her grandfather George C. as a restless soul, and so, in 1883, they staked out 160 acres in South Dakota west of Aberdeen. Annie wrote a fascinating account of her arriving at the railhead in Aberdeen with 5-year-old Keith in the middle of a freezing winter and heading west on a stagecoach, probably a crude-covered wagon, and the adventures they had sleeping in the rafters of half-built houses along the way to join George on the land. In 1888, they moved to a sod house on new land south of Bowdle, and son George Harrison Skinner is born the same year, known forever after as Uncle Harry. In 1896, he staked another claim adjacent. And I think this is all in preparation for selling all these bits of land to go out to California, which he does about 1897. He buys a farm here in Paris Valley, south of Riverside. But the developers never bring in water. The orchard he planted dies, and he loses his shirt. But all that time, his son Keith is bicycling 20 miles a day each way to high school in Riverside. Then, around 1900 or so, he picks up and buys 8.5 acres in Clovis, California, as son Keith starts at UC Berkeley, and plants grapes for raisins and is reasonably successful. Their son Harry kind of runs the place, while he and Annie move to Berkeley around 1905 or so to a house on Milvia Street. After Annie dies here in 1909 at the age of 57 from breast cancer, he moves back to Fresno, where he dies ultimately in 1917. Uncle Harry, who was born in South Dakota 10 years younger than Keith, lived on this property until it was sold after George C.'s death, and continued to live in the Fresno area and work in the grapes the rest of his life. Mom was close to Uncle Harry because he would go live with them in Oakland during the winter 3 months of the year, as Mom was growing up. Our Tupper story begins in Darmstadt, Germany, where Samuel Tupper is born in 1478. In Germany, their name Tupper refers to a person who makes ceramics. His wife, for whom we have only the name Mrs. Samuel Tupper, dies giving birth to his son Robert in the year 1500. The Lutheran Reformation breaks out in 1517, which may have prompted Samuel and son Robert to immigrate to England. They settle at Bury, up here outside Manchester, and 3 generations later are calling themselves the Tuppers of Bury. Now, Thomas Tupper is born in 1578, and at age 14 apprentices in London as a shoemaker. In 1621, at age 43, he signs on as crew to the ship Abigail, bound for Virginia, learns carpentry, and becomes the ship's carpenter. After that trip, he had a little money and married Catherine Gator in 1622 at Chelmsford, near London. He sails for Virginia again that same year on the Abigail, while his wife bears him a daughter, Catherine. In 1626, his wife Catherine dies in childbirth, and the infant Thomas is lost soon after. The next voyage of the Abigail is to Salem, Massachusetts in 1628, and having no wife, he takes 6-year-old Catherine with him. This time he gets off the boat in Salem and meets and marries Susan Turner, a widow, in Topsfield, Massachusetts. They have 2 sons, but only Robert, born in 1632, lives. 2 years later, his wife Susan dies. Meanwhile, Anne Hodgson, also from Chelmsford, England, has come to Massachusetts in 1628 with her husband, Henry Lawson, but he dies that first winter. Thomas Tupper later finds her and marries her in Ipswich, Massachusetts in 1634. 3 years later, he and 10 other men and their families go down to the Cape Cod Peninsula and found the town of Sandwich. There he builds this house that stands for almost 300 years before being burned by a fire in 1921. And he and Anne have a son, Thomas, who is our direct descendant. Our 7th great-grandfather, to be precise. Thomas Sr. lives here as a pillar of the community for 30 more years until he and Anne both die in 1676. Here in Sandwich, Thomas Tupper II is born in 1637. Meanwhile, down here in Martha's Vineyard, Governor Thomas Mayhew is given governorship in 1650, and his daughter Martha Mayhew was born in 1642. Yes, your direct ancestor is responsible for the naming of Martha's Vineyard. A little later on, they meet up here in Sandwich, and Thomas II marries Martha in 1661. They have 16 children. Numbers 6 through 8 die as infants. Second-born Eliakim dies at 17, so 13th born is named Eliakim again. In 1707, Eliakim marries Joanna Gibbs Fish, and they move out here to Lebanon, Connecticut, with their 21-year-old son, Elias Fish Tupper. 1740, Elias Fish marries Jerusha Sprague. Where did Jerusha come from? Let's take a look. In 1629, Ralph Sprague arrives in Salem from England. His son Jonathan is born in 1656. He marries Mary Woodworth, born in 1682, and their daughter Jerusha Sprague ends up marrying Elias Fish Tupper in 1740. They have 7 children, including our ancestor Elias II, born 1753. But because they are loyalists to the crown and the American Revolution is coming, they move to Nova Scotia, to a place that will later be called Tupperville. Elias II is 7 when they move here, and later, when he is 16, he marries Rachel Porter in 1769. They have a son, Elias III, in 1785. He then grows up here and marries Rebecca Ann Beckwith in 1809. And who is Rebecca Beckwith? Let's take a look. This is Hartford, Connecticut, where Reynold Marvin arrives from England in 1635. A few generations later, the Marvins had migrated down here to the coast at Lyme, Connecticut, and one of them marries a Beckwith, and Rebecca Ann is born in 1789. But her folks are loyalists also, so they ended up here in Tupperville, Nova Scotia. As soon as they get married, they come down here to Ontario and stake out 100 acres. Here's a picture of them, probably about 1840 to 1850. You gotta love it. The sod house, the well, he's got his gun on his shoulder, a couple dozen chickens, his oldest son manning the team. They had 10 children. Jeremiah was born here in 1821. He marries Matilda Pettit in 1844, and they have their daughter Susan Annie Tupper in 1851. She, of course, is Mom's grandmother. So, who is Annie Tupper's mom, Matilda Pettit? Well, as usual, it starts back in here in England in 1610 with Thomas Pettit, who was born in Chelmsford after a couple of generations that we know of before him. He's the one that comes to America And he arrives here in 1630 and lives for 7 years in downtown Boston, but he's a crusty old dude who doesn't get along with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So he moves out here to Exeter. Well, in a few years, the Massachusetts Bay Colony takes control of Exeter. So he moves out of there and he moves down here to live with the Dutch people that he gets along better with. Down here in Newton, now Elmhurst, Queens. And after a few generations, his descendant Nathaniel Pettit moves out here to New Jersey in 1718 and establishes a couple thousand-acre farm out here, on which now the State House of New Jersey is located there next to the Delaware River. In 1730, Charles Pettit is born. He marries Sarah Reed in 1758. They have 2 stillbirths. Then he marries Mary Smith in 1760. And they have 16 children, 3 of which die in infancy. Charles Pettit is also a loyalist, so in 1775 he moves up to Saltfleet Township, Ontario, and here's this gorgeous picture. And he's got a couple hundred acres there, and 100 years later you can see how many Pettits have property there in Saltfleet, Ontario. They're all over the place. As it happens, there's also a bunch of Beadles in Saltfleet, Ontario, and 2 generations after Charles, another Charles marries Anna Beadle in 1817, and they come here to Windham County in Ontario for their farm. And here you see Charles and his daughter Matilda, who marries Jeremiah Tupper. Over here you can see how they were close in property, and this is all going on in Norfolk County, Ontario. Now, before we get started with Matilda Pettit's mother's side, the Beadles, I'd like to talk about ancestry. This is a pedigree chart. It shows 17 generations. Yes, we're horses and show dogs. Yes. Starting with me, this goes to the 14th great-grandfathers and mothers. Every one of us has 131,070 ancestors through 14th greats. Not counting the siblings of all those people who are cousins. There's no way to calculate cousins because it's a variable number. Now, I want to show you how these charts work with the Beadles because they go way back. We got Jeremiah Tupper and Matilda Martha Pettit, whose mother was a Beadle. So here we have Jeremiah Tupper, Matilda, and Matilda Pettit. So Matilda's mom is Ann Beadle. Her dad is Stephen Beadle. Then we're going back. Silas, born in 1717. Joseph was his father. Then Daniel, born in 1646. And Robert Beadle, his is the one that came from England. His father, John Beadle, from England, lived in England and died in England. And his father, also John Beadle. And then a third John Beadle up here who was born in 1558. And his father was Stephen Beadle, but he was married to Margaret Highfield, who was born in 1526. Her father was Sir William Highfield, but her mother was Catherine Davenport, born in 1512. And her father, Thomas Davenport, and the Davenports go all the way back to 1066 for the Norman invasion. And of course, we have a Digby in our ancestry. Here it is. Agnes, Lady Digby of Coleshill, daughter of Sir Everhard, married William Highfield I and John Villiers II, born 1475 in Coleshill, and died at the Dublin Castle in Ireland in 1505. Now we're going to start with Robert Beadle, who I mentioned was born in 1624. just above Chelmsford in Fairstead, and he came to America, established himself on Long Island in 1650. The Beatles lived here for about 4 generations, and then Joseph Beadle moved over here to Staten Island. He died in 1768, but he had Stephen Beadle, who was born in 1745 here on Staten Island. He was also a loyalist, so in 1776 he moved up here to Sussex, New Brunswick, where his daughter Anna Beadle was born in 1793. Now it bears noting that with 44 others in 1784 he was working on a land grant for 7,400 acres above St. John, New Brunswick. Anyway, here they are in Sussex. Anna Beadle was born in 1793, and then they moved to Saltfleet Township in Ontario. Here's his land in 1815 with his daughter Anna. Now here I want to take a moment and show you how he found these plots of land. Here's an old plot of land map, and here's an example of James B. Pettit and his property and how they showed him on these maps. Just a little bit of information for you. So Anna Beadle married Charles Pettit here in 1817. But in 1812, it should be noted that Charles Pettit was a hero of the Canadian forces at the Battle of Queenston Height in the War of 1812. Here's a little oil painting of the battle, and here's a contemporary picture of what the land looked like on Queenston Heights. Anyway, they settle here in Windham County. Here's Charles Pettit, and his daughter Matilda Pettit is here, and she marries Jeremiah Tupper, as we've heard before. So it's Millicent Ward Skinner. So her mom was Millicent Archer Ward, and so where did Millicent Archer Ward come from? Here is the Ward family in England in the 1700s. What we know starts with William Ward, 1730 in Newcastle. His son John Ward, 1752, a little bit south of there. Mary Handley was born down here in Wolverhampton, and John Ward marries Mary Handley in Wolverhampton in 1776, of all years, just above Wednesbury here. Then James Ward is born in 1772 in Woburn, and that's Mom's great-great-grandfather. And he marries Diana Carter down here in Chatham in 1787, her hometown, and they move back to Wednesbury. In 1797, our great-great-grandfather James Ward was born here in Wednesbury. In 1818, he marries Hannah Peters. They have a daughter in 1818, but both Hannah and daughter die of cholera in 1833. In 1834, he's up here in Nottingham marrying Elizabeth Archer. Joseph Archer Ward, our mom's grandfather, was born in 1835, but alas, as happened to Mom, his mother, Elizabeth Archer, dies in childbirth. So James Ward marries Elizabeth Taylor in 1836. They have Sharon Ward in 1837, Eliza Ward in 1840, but she dies in about a year. Edward James Ward was born in 1842. Daughter Sharon dies in 1853, but son Edward immigrates to Utah in 1862, builds his folks a house in Pleasant Grove, Utah. And before we get out of here, though, yes, this is Nottingham, and up here is Sherwood Forest, just so you know. In 1861, they were living in the Lace District of Nottingham, and he was listed in the census as a cloth dealer. James had been baptized into the Church of the Latter-day Saints in 1848, And in 1863, they came to the United States. They joined a wagon train here in Iowa City, Iowa. And they came out to Utah, stopping first at Deseret, Utah, and then proceeding on to their home in Pleasant Grove that their son Edwin had built for them. And just to show you, this is just south of Salt Lake City, Utah. James died in 1869 and only got to live in Utah for 3 years, but his widow lived on for quite a while. Now we're going to go back to their son, James Archer Ward. And at the age of 15, he was working as a farmer's helper here in Spalding, Lincolnshire, England. But shortly after that, he found his way to Liverpool, England. And after working here for a while, in 1850, he signed up on a ship bringing guano from Chile back to the European continent. This is big business for a few years just in this time. 1852, here's Bird Guano Island, the Chincha Islands, Peru. They were loading it up and taking it to Europe for fertilizer for crops. You think it was weird having a worm farmer in the family? Well, we got a guano trader. Yeah. Then by 1870, he's up here in Laramie, Wyoming, running a boarding house with his wife, Mary Sanday. Where did Mary come from? Well, let's take a look. Okay, over here in England, Mary Sanday's mother, Mary Sanday, was born here in Braceby, England in 1803. And over here, the Sandays had been living in Cotgrave since 1581, many generations. Joseph Sanday, her husband, was born in 1810. And in 1843, they had their daughter Mary Sanday here in Bingham in Nottinghamshire. Don't know what happened exactly, but by the time Mary Sanday was 10 years old, here in Nottingham, she was living in a poorhouse. And then 7 years later, she had found a cousin to live with by 1860. But Joseph Archer Ward somehow hooked up with her here in Liverpool. And eventually they got married and ended up in Wyoming, of all places, Laramie, Wyoming, running a boarding house. From Laramie, they moved to Yankee Hill, California, and they're running a boarding house there, apparently. They lived here from 1873 to 1884. And then they moved to Willows, California, and they ran a restaurant and maybe a boarding house by around 1882. And this is where my mother's mother, Millicent Archer Ward, was born. And they moved to Vallejo between 1896 and 1900 so Millicent Archer Ward could go to high school. And here they moved to Oakland at 4808 Fairfax Avenue so that Millicent Archer Ward could go to UC Berkeley. But before Millicent Archer was born, Joseph and Agnes were born here in Yankee Hill, and then after Millicent was born way later in 1896, her brother Warren was born here in Oakland. Here's a picture of Warren and his wife Edna. We remember Mom referring to Aunt Edna our whole lives, and this is she. We also remember her referring to poor old Agnes our whole lives. And here is Agnes with her father, Keith Skinner, later on in years. And, of course, Edna did the yeoman job of bringing Mom up and taking care of her. So that's it for now, as I'm not really telling the story of my mom's generation or that much of their parents either. Now, before we talk about Dad's side, we're going to have a little fun, go up to the top of Mount Niesen in Switzerland, and have a little look around. Okay, so everybody knows the Neesons start in Germany. So here's Germany. Starts with our great-great-great-grandfather, Nicholas Neeson, born in 1780 in Sands. He marries Joannetta Kurlinger in 1808. And who is she? She's the daughter of Peter Kurlinger, who married Margareta in 1769, and Joannetta was born 1781. So they live in Sands, but for some reason, Nicholas Neeson, our double great-grandfather, was born in Trier, and he was born there in 1811. But really, they lived in Sands, and our great-great Nicholas marries Magdalena Katharina Olinger here in Sands, and then they decide to immigrate. So they go up to Antwerp, Belgium, and they depart for America in 1847, arriving in Ellis Island, of course. Nicholas, Magdalena, and 3 children in 1847. And the first place they settle is in Nunda McHenry, Illinois. They have 40 acres. And the birth of son Peter C. Neeson, which is our great-grandfather. And here's his 40 acres. Peter C. was born in 1853. And son John R. Neeson, born down here for some reason in Bunker Hill in 1852. Anyway, Nicholas Neeson takes his 40 acres and sells it and whatever, and comes up here and he wants 80 acres, which he gets in 1858 in the town of St. Michael in Wright County, Minnesota. Now I'm going to take you down to street level because there's something I want you to see. Still standing in real time here in the year of 2022 is the Neeson family homestead sign. So they're going to have a red arrow on it right here. And here's some close-ups for it. And this sign is still standing at the Neeson homestead, which is now only 40 acres, actually, because some of it was sold off. We're going to be sweeping by around here in our panoramic view. And the fact of the matter is this 40 acres is for sale right now. Here's the listing. If anybody wants to scrape up $1.3 million, we can go back there and buy the Neeson homestead. Now, before I go any further, I need to talk about Kip Hollingbeck, who came to our house and told a story of 4 Ackerman sisters marrying 3 Neeson brothers. The fact is, there was only 3, Francis, Michael, and Peter. They married 3 Ackerman sisters. The first of those was the oldest son, Frank, who moved up here to Bogus Brook Township, Minnesota, with his wife, Kate Ackerman, and they had 17 children, although I think one died early in infancy. The part that Kip forgot to tell, however, is that 2 of the Neeson sisters married 2 Geringer brothers. Helena married Charles, and Mary Catherine married Christian. This is where Charles and Helena lived. He was a barber. And the other Neeson daughter, which is Mary C., she married Christian Geringer, and they owned a bar here by the river in Minneapolis where her brother Peter used to work when he was young. Getting back to the Ackerman sisters, Michael Neeson married Sophie Ackerman, and guess what they had? They also had a bar in Minneapolis, which they worked for many, many years. And they lived here in 823 20th Avenue Northeast. And now we start the story of Peter C. Neeson. Never could figure out what the C stands for. Sorry about that. But he starts his working life up here at Sauk Center, Minnesota, at age 16, being a farm laborer. which is just about right for a 16-year-old. But by the time he's 19 years old, I think, he's down here working for his sister and brother-in-law's bar, Christian Geringer. That was Christian you just saw. And then he gets a job as a fireman with the city of Minneapolis. And now having a job, he marries Mary Ackerman, the third Ackerman sister. And now that he has a job and a wife, they move out to this place here, which is no longer here, of course. And they have 4 children. Teresa, known as Aunt Tracy, Michael Peter, our grandfather, Peter B., and Marie, who becomes the mother of Kip Hollenbeck, who comes out to tell the story. When Peter C. dies as a fireman at the age of 37, his wife Lena becomes the first recipient of the new Minneapolis City Pension Fund. And so she has a little bit of money every month. She comes out here and buys this house on 34th Avenue, lives there for something like 50 years. According to Kip Hollenbeck, every Neeson in the state of Minnesota comes and lives there one time or another in all that time. And just as another footnote, the bar business wasn't all that bad if you did it right. Christian Geringer and Mary Catherine Neeson retired to this house, not too far from Lena's house on 16th Avenue, and they're doing all right. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Michael Peter Neeson grows up to the age of 24, and he heads out to San Francisco to try his luck. He becomes a manufacturer of coat hangers using equipment that he designed himself to cut the shapes efficiently. And then he goes to Los Angeles. And guess who he bumps into in an elevator in FX Lordou's building? Jermaine Lordou. Oh, yeah. They go back to San Francisco. They go live in Sausalito for the first bunch of years. And they have a good time. And they give birth to our father, Clifford Francis Neeson. And the rest I've told you in other stories. The Lordou story starts in France, of course, and down in the south part of France is where the Lordous were born. In 1828, Francois Gustave Lordou was born in the town of Buzane. And before we go any further, I just want to take you on a little trip around present-day Buzane, just because it's so gorgeous. And here's where the Lordous started out hundreds of years ago, and it's almost looking the same, and it's so beautiful. So this is Buzane, France, in the south, near the Pyrenees Mountains. Anyway, Francois Gustave Lordou was born there. He went to Paris from there. Yes, this is Paris, where the Eiffel Tower is going to be built a little bit later. Meanwhile, in Bourret, France, Félicité Bignon is born in 1834, and she also goes to Paris, where she meets Francois Gustave Lordou. And they were married here in Paris in 1858. And in 1860, Auguste Francois Xavier Lordou was born. That's our great-great-grandfather. Meanwhile, out in Normandy, in Oradour, France, Julien Louvel was born in 1616, and 4 generations later, they ended up in Ernay, France, where Jean-François Bourget was born in 1824, and Marie Letizier in 1827. They went to Paris to get married, came back, and had our great-grandmother, Clarice Marie Rose Bourget. And isn't this a fantastic picture of them? Meanwhile, back in Paris, Auguste Francois Xavier Lordou otherwise known as FX from now on. Our great-grandfather joins the French army at the age of 19, and in 1879 he is shipped off to Saigon on the transport ship Le Tonkin, which is, of course, we know about the Tonkin Gulf from later. Here he is in Saigon, which is, of course, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, and he wrote a great big old journal about this whole affair, which I'm going to post to the Ancestry website later, and I encourage you to all read it. After military service, he comes back to Paris, where in 1885 he meets and marries Clarice Marie Rose, our great-grandmother, and they have their 4 children, Lucy, Gustave, Germaine, and Maurice. And here's a picture of Germaine at the age 16 in her finery, and isn't she sweet looking? And then about 1900 he gets the gold bug and heads to South Africa to mine for diamonds. He established a mine with a partner, I don't know their name, at the Barkley West mine in South Africa. I'll have some pictures of this in just a little bit. But what they do is they establish this mine. They have native workers that live down slightly south of it in a place called Good Hope. And the town nearby is called Barkley West. He does this a couple of years, and then the Boer War starts, and they bail, and he heads back to France. At that time, the big parlor entertainment was these stereo viewing devices with pictures of historic scenes and etc. So FX goes out and gets a camera that takes these stereo photos. So in the next section of the movie, we're going to pause here so that you all have time to put on your blue and red stereo sunglasses that we handed out. And we're going to look at some of these stereo photos that FX took all over the world. Now we're back, and we'll take a look at some of these photos. We start out with the most famous cathedral in the whole world, Notre Dame de Paris. Notice the branches in the foreground. Here is some detail from the Notre Dame Cathedral showing the flying buttresses. And here is the priest's house next to Notre Dame, where the various priests live to officiate the services. Here we are at the Cathedral Reims, looking at the towers on the western facade. It had been bombed in the war, so here's some interior vaulting before it was repaired. Here is an unknown gate to some kind of gardens in Paris, but it's very nice. And then we have the Dufayel apartment store in Paris, and here's one of the facades. And this says Meublement, Tapis and Tenture, which means furniture, carpet, and hangings of the Dufayel. Here's the Maison Martin, Paris, otherwise known as the Martin House. And here's the famous Hotel du Trocadero, Paris, undoubtedly where Les Ballets Trocadero de Monte Carlo was originated. Here's the English restaurant in Paris, and where you could probably get bagels and mash. And here is the Eiffel Tower, not great 3D, but you can see the buildings in the foreground and whatnot. Of course, FX worked on the Eiffel Tower. Here's one close up, and you can see the building in the lower left corner. And here's the feet of the Eiffel Tower, and they're not that heavily girdered, so, you know, that's the engineering that Eiffel did. This is the Carlsbad Castle in dry dock, one of the ships that he rode on. And here's another ship he was on called Le Breton, and this picture's on deck, and it's wet, so notice the foreground. And here's Le Breton and Doc. There's a mule and a cart there. Remember, this is before cars, a lot of it. He made it to China, so here's the frozen white river with like some taxi service people skidding on the ice. Here we are at the Bankley West diamond mine in South Africa. Notice this guy is throwing a shovel of dirt. Here is guys looking for diamonds amidst the dirt at the Bankley West. And here they're fishing with dynamite, which is totally inappropriate in the modern era, but that was then. And here's one of my favorites, one of the trains they're taking across the Transvaal, March 1901. Here are his black laborers at the mine, and they have a couple of fresh wildebeest there. Here's a tribesman of the Mobai, which was a tribe north of their diggings. And here's some young women of the Mobai tribe. And now here he is with his family. That's Lucy is the little one, their oldest child. And this is family, which is unidentified, but they're in Luxembourg. And then earlier, this is the ship that he took to Vietnam. He did not take this photo, but I found it online, Le Tonquin. And here's a view of the deck of Le Tonquin. Unknown. I think this was taken after his voyage. And here we're going to pause the movie so you can take your glasses off. And we'll get right back to the movie. Now back in Paris in 1903, after having fled South Africa, FX decides to go to America to establish himself as an architect there. Leaving Marie Rose and the 4 children in Paris, he heads for Le Havre, France, which is French for the haven. Here he boards the French packet boat La Savoie and heads out for Ellis Island in New York City, from where he takes a train to San Francisco, where he has his first office in 1903. For about a year, he's in San Francisco. He has his office here, and his residence was only a few blocks away down here. I never even knew that he was in San Francisco, but there you have it. And after a year in San Francisco, he decides L.A. is a better place to stake his fortune, and he heads to L.A. in 1904. Here's his office on Main Street. Now, this year, he sends for his daughter Lucy to come join him in the United States. So she boards the liner La Bretagne and lands in New York on February 10th. And she too takes a train to L.A., where she joins her father. The next year, he moves his office down the street to the Lalonde building, right across from what is now the present-day Los Angeles City Hall. Then he sends for Gustave to come from France, because of course he needs help. Gustave is also an architect and a draftsman, and works for FX the rest of his life in Los Angeles. He boards the Savoie again, and heads to L.A. He moves his office again, and in 1906 sends for his family. So Marie Rose, Germaine, and Maurice board the La Lorraine and head for L.A. Here it is in all its glory. Or actually, that was a little later, after its glory. And then they live, at that point, they move almost across the street from his offices at 222 North Main, Los Angeles. By 1910, they live out just slightly further away at 1125 Angelina, and they live there for quite a while. And then he moves out to Arcadia to the east, but he only lives there for a year or so because it bothered Marie Rose's asthma, and they moved back downtown because it was easier for her to be close to medical help at 346 South Figueroa Street, also very near to downtown. As you can see, his whole office movement was all in downtown, and they finally ended up at 207 South Broadway Street in Los Angeles. And in this building, they had an elevator. And in that elevator, Germain, at the age of 16, while helping type up specifications for jobs, met Michael Peter Neeson. They sparked each other in the elevator. They got married in 1912, moved north to Sausalito, where they had Dad in 1913. Had a lot of fun, apparently. Here's a picture of them when they went up on the Mount Tam railway that went to the top of Mount Tam from Sausalito. There's a picture of them all smiling nicely. And then, of course, it was quite a bit of commute for his shop where he made coat hangers in San Francisco. So they were living back here in the outer Sunset in 1917. And, of course, in 1918, Michael Peter died of the Spanish flu. So Germain didn't want to go back down to L.A. She got herself an apartment with 5-year-old Clifford. The graphic is wrong. She got this place to be near her job at Don Lee Upholstery, which did car tops. And, of course, famously in that shop, she met Art Swift. And as they say, the rest is history, and we'll hear more of that history with the Swift apartment. The Swift story starts in England, as so many have, and it's just as amazing as any of the others. Starts here in Rotherham, Yorkshire, with the birth of William John Swift in 1530. And then his son is born here, William Swift, in 1589. And his son, William Swift Jr., the English immigrant, is born here in 1619. William Swift I and II arrive on the Primrose here in Sandwich in 1635. Sandwich, the same place the Tuppers were. But they lived here for 4 generations in a row. William Swift, born in 1654. Samuel Swift, born in 1686. Manasseh in 1715. Ephraim in 1749. And then somebody finally moved down here just north of Martha's Vineyard. And Ezra Swift is born in 1768 in Falmouth. And after that, they moved up to Wareham, Massachusetts, where Captain Howlett Swift Jr. was born in 1802. In 1832, Captain Howlett marries Elizabeth Peckham. They have 8 children, one of which is our ancestor Howlett Lamadue Swift, born in 1843. Lamadue is French for the man with God. How can you not love a man whose middle name is the man of God? Anyway, all this time, Captain Howlett is plying his trade as a sea captain, making many trips. And then he gets ready to make his final trip, which is to the gold fields of California in 1850. So he heads out in his trusty ship. He's going around the Cape Horn of South America on his way to the San Francisco Bay. He gets to the bay, and he does what many, many other ship captains did. He leaves his trusty ship in the bay, which they later fill in with dirt, and they get buried between all the houses. And there's a picture of San Francisco Bay in 1850, as you can see. Now here we're looking at San Francisco City Hall complex as it is today. And that big red triangle, however, in 1850 was a cemetery called Yerba Buena Cemetery. And when Captain Hallett gets off his ship, he becomes the proprietor of this cemetery. In 1861, however, they stopped putting bodies in it, and in 1871, the city takes the land because it's to make a new city hall, and here's a picture of it. However, along comes 1906, and here's that beautiful city hall after 1906, so there you have it. By 1880, Captain Hallett and his wife Mary are up here in Santa Rosa, of all places, where his wife Mary dies in 1880. At that point, Captain Hallett goes back to Wareham, Massachusetts, where he lives for 6 more years and dies in 1886. Now we head back to San Francisco to pick up the trail of Hallett Lomadew Swift. Hallett Lomadew Swift became a drayman, or a teamster, whatever you want to call him. He was like a UPS driver in modern parlance. He did that the rest of his life and lived in a number of places. Here's one at 1877 to 1878. Then he's over here, and he meets and marries Anna Louise Goslin in 1880. And he has his son Arthur Garfield Swift in 1880. Then he's back over here in what is now City Hall area. He lives there for about a year. Then he's back over here in 1015 Golden Gate, and he lives from here from 96 to 98. And in this place, Arthur Garfield Swift meets and marries Mary Hogan in 1899. And Arthur Patrick Swift is born in 1899. After Lomadew's death, his widow Anne lives over here in 1910 for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Arthur Garfield Swift becomes an engineer because he doesn't want to be a teamster or a ship's captain, I guess. It's the modern world. He becomes an engineer. He moves to Oakland. He's working on all kinds of machinery. His wife, Mary Hogan, died in 1902 when Arthur Patrick Swift was 3. He is now married to his wife, Nellie. But in 1920, he is divorced from her. And in 1930, he's living over here in Oakland with his son, Hallett, who Nellie gave him. And he marries his wife, Pearl. And they move to San Mateo for the rest of their lives because he's working for another big company down here doing his engineering. And he dies in 1950. Meanwhile, from back here, Arthur Patrick Swift had flown the coop about age 19. And at age 19, he found himself in San Francisco living on Lombard Street. And he was working at the famous Don Lee Upholstery. Where have you heard that before? Yes, this is where Germaine was also working and living in an apartment nearby. So here they are, Art and Germaine, from that time when they met each other, and we know the rest is history.